Hello, I'm Tom Hinton. I'm a senior lecturer in French at the University of Exeter.
And I'm Edward Mills. I am a postdoctoral research associate, also here at the University of Exeter. We both work within the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures, but our work in modern languages and cultures extends slightly further back in time than you might expect. And today we want to show you just how far back modern languages research can go by talking about a text that tells us something about how French was used as a language of learning and as a language of teaching in medieval England.
I want to start by taking you back to the high street of a medieval town around the year 1300. So the image on screen is the Shambles in York, which is one of Britain's most famous medieval streets. And I want you to imagine the sights and the sounds and the smells, the mixture of human and animal. Now let's duck into a tavern where in the corner a couple of merchants are having a lively conversation. They're speaking French, although from his accent one of them is definitely English. A couple of streets away at the local school, the English merchant's son is listening to his master. Among his school friends are an aristocrat's son and a boy from a local village whose education is being sponsored by a local priest in the hope that one day he'll take religious orders. The schoolmaster's explaining the basics of Latin to them in French. Just outside, two clergymen are discussing a sermon that one of them gave at the cathedral that morning, and they're talking French with the odd word of Latin and perhaps English mixed in. And now I want to lead you back to the town square where the town crier has just arrived to read out an official decree, and he starts by saying oyez, which is medieval French for listen, listen.
And as that little ramble through the shambles, if you like, shows us, French was more widely used in medieval England than you might otherwise think. You may have come across the idea that the elite in medieval England spoke French, and that's why words for meat on the table, like venison or beef, come from French, whereas words for animals in the field, like cow, come from English. And that may be true, and we certainly can't discount the importance of the arrival of 1,000 or so highly aristocratic French speakers in 1066 in the form of the Norman Conquest, in understanding why French was spoken in medieval England. But that straightforward story isn't the whole story, really, and it certainly doesn't explain one of the questions we're looking at in this project, which is why French goes from being a language spoken in 1066 by about 1% of the population in England to a language spoken, according to one estimate, by around 20% of the population to some degree in 1300.
So that's where our project, Learning French in Medieval England, comes in. We want to understand the transmission of French in medieval England by producing an edition of a text known as the Tritis, which was written by a 13th century Essex knight called Walter de Bibsworth. The prologue to the Tritis says that it was written for an aristocratic lady called Denise de Montchensey to teach her children. And it goes on to say that it will teach the French, all the French from when a nobleman is born and the language of his youth, and then the French for when he comes of age.
The Tritis survives in 17 manuscripts, which is a lot for a medieval text. And that in and of itself says quite a lot about how popular the Tritis actually was. It follows, broadly speaking, a journey around a medieval estate, and we're invited to understand vocabulary for topics pertinent to managing that estate, things like baking, brewing, and so on. You might expect the Tritis to work in a similar manner to a modern textbook. And it does start with a description of forms of the body and parts of the body. But it looks a little bit less like this, and altogether like a rather different beast.
So this image gives a good idea of how the Tritis works. First of all, you'll see that it's written in rhymed French verse, so it's not just a list of words. And the use of rhyme means that you can bring words together which sound the same in a playful way in order to help you to understand the differences between them. So one example is ruby and rupie, the two words that mean ruby and snot in modern English. And the text says, if my purse was as full of rubies as my nose is of rupees, then I would be rich indeed.
We very much enjoy that little particular bit of the Tritis on this project. This image that you can see behind you here is from a different part of the text, and one that we'll come on to in just a moment. But it shows something that is also evident in that passage about snots and purses, specifically the role of what we call glossing. So you can see to the right of the image, we have Middle English text, and that would have been associated by the reader to parts of the French text. So we have terms in French which are glossed, to use the technical medievalist term, into Middle English.
This passage also nicely illustrates the fun aspect of the text. So it's a discussion of different words for red, for what that could be rendered in red in English, in using different words in French. So the text, I'll just quote from it here, says, "Here comes a handsome red knight, mounted on a red horse, and carrying a red shield. In one hand he holds a red lance, and in the other hand he has a glass of red wine. And he eats no fish if it's not red herring." And the purpose of this image is to really give you a memorable visualization that helps you to retain the words that the text wants to teach you.
And that, again, particularly fun example, the Tritis is full of these, by the way, gives us something of an insight into how French was learned in the medieval period. But it's also a really useful tool for lexicographers, people who study the history of words and where they come from and what they mean. The Tritis contains a whole raft of terms, like maldrop, in fact, the one for bogey that we had earlier, that don't really appear in conventionally literary texts. So they're a really, really useful resource in helping us to understand how French and English relate to one another today. We're also looking quite closely at how these texts work in their manuscript form, producing what we've called our digital edition of the Tritis. Medieval manuscripts can be quite hard to decipher, so one of the first things that we're trying to do is to make these manuscripts pretty and possibly illegible to some people as they might look, accessible.
So we'll tell you more in a minute about why a digital edition of the Tritis is a very good idea. But first we want to say a little bit more about manuscripts. So when you think of a medieval manuscript, you probably are going to imagine something a bit like this, with beautiful pictures, intense decoration, lots of colour, and that's an idea that the likes of Shrek and Disney have really reinforced over the years. And those kinds of manuscripts do exist, and they're probably the ones that get all the press.
Yes, and you may have guessed where we're going with this. That's not the kind of manuscript that we tend to have when we're looking at the Tritis. That level of decoration, of illustration, the fancy borders and the beautiful illuminated pictures that we can see there was an expense that wasn't really worthwhile for many of the more functional manuscripts that were built to be used rather than to be looked at in a corner. And many of the Tritis manuscripts fall into the category of utilitarian manuscripts. They're not pretty, but they deserve attention.
Yeah, the Tritis is mostly found in manuscripts used for classroom teaching, like this. So you can see that these manuscripts on the whole are pretty plain, maybe a bit scruffy, especially the one in the top right. The one in the top left is a bit of an exception because it's got some very nice use of red decoration, and the presentation is particularly careful.
It was a starting point for our edition, though, that each one of these manuscripts, pretty or not, is just as important as any other, because each one represents a different take on the Tritis. It might be tempting to think of the Tritis as a textbook in the modern sense of the word. Imagine it's late August and a university press somewhere is firing up the printing presses to produce 100 identical editions of the Tritis, which is suddenly going out to customers everywhere. That's not what's going on here. What we've got instead is a much more individual process. We know that if someone copied or had copied the Tritis, they'd done it for a particular purpose, and different scribes did different things, leaving things out, adding things in, omitting or extending sections, and changing what was glossed. So we're working from the principle that each manuscript represents a unique take on the Tritis. Each manuscript is produced differently, and each manuscript has a role to play in helping us understanding what the Tritis was doing and how French was used as well.
And that's what's hard to capture with a traditional print edition such as this. So if I open this up, you can see on screen we're back at the passage on the Red Knight. And a print edition can give us one manuscript version of the text, but what about all the others? Well, they have to be shunted down to the bottom here. We call these variants. And the result is messy, and as you can see, it can be very hard to get a sense of what each individual version of the text is actually doing.
And that's where our digital edition, which we're currently working on, comes in. A digital edition lets you do things that you can't do with the technology of a printed page. You can choose what you display, you can choose what you view, and users can make that decision as well. So you can make decisions, for example, about what exactly you want to see, whether viewers want to see two bits from manuscripts displayed alongside one another, whether they want to see an image from a manuscript displayed alongside an edition of that same manuscript. Users get the choice.
And that's required us to learn another language, hasn't it?
Yes, it absolutely has. Yeah, we've had to familiarise ourselves with another language alongside medieval French and modern English that lets us ask all kinds of questions. We want to be in a position where users of our digital edition of the Tritis can ask questions like, okay, show me all of the different ways that chevalier, the word for knight, has been glossed into English across all of the different manuscripts. We want to ask questions like, show me that Red Knight passage again, side by side, so I can get really picky and look at all of the differences between them. And we want to be able to do things that I mentioned earlier, like, show me a manuscript image alongside a really, really, really accurate transcription of it. Just because I don't quite trust these two editors here who have edited this text, I want to make sure that they've done this absolutely right. And XML is one of the really challenging things that we've had to learn. Here's an example of XML in context, and there's an awful lot going on here. XML works a bit like HTML, the language that web pages are written in. It uses tags around elements, but these tags don't say how something should display. They say what something actually is. So you'll have tags, for example, like names. You'll have tags for a term. For us, in our edition, you'll have a tag for something like a gloss as well. And then we're working very closely with colleagues in digital humanities to make that XML into a reality.
And that digital humanities element has been crucial to the project,
Oh, yeah,
hasn't it?
absolutely, yeah. We've had to work very closely, and it's been a pleasure to work very closely with our colleagues in DH, which is a really exciting area of work at the moment, so that when viewers come to look at our edition, they're able to make these choices. They're able to have a website presented to them where our XML is sitting in the background doing the work, and they can ask all of the research questions which, as we saw earlier with the print edition, are not currently possible.
Recently, we've been working with an early version of the web interface that users will be able to consult to ask these kinds of questions, and that's been really exciting. And we're looking forward to being able to launch a full version of the website soon.
We've also been really fortunate to work with colleagues from other universities. So we've been able to work with two wonderful MA students from the University of Leiden in the Netherlands to work more closely with the Middle English component of the Tritis. And we're really looking forward to showing you, as Tom says, what this project will bear in due course. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and if you have, we strongly encourage you to look up our project, Learning French in Medieval England, to see how our work is progressing. Thank you very much.